The day Georgia Wells was handed over like a sack of grain at the edge of her father's property. She did not cry. She had run out of tears somewhere around her 19th birthday, and that had been a full year ago now. It was the spring of 1874, and the Texas panhandle smelled of red dirt and dry grass, and the kind of heat that promised to only get worse before it ever got better. The sky stretched out in every direction without a single cloud to soften it, pale blue and merciless, and Georgia stood beside the split-rail fence at the edge of the Wells property with a single carpetbag at her feet, and her hands folded in front of her, because she did not know what else to do with them. Her father, Eldon Wells, stood a few feet away from her. He was a thick-necked man with sun-darkened skin and a gray mustache that he kept trimmed because he believed it made him look respectable. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and he had never once hidden which of those 4 children he considered the least valuable. "You will go with him," Eldon said, not looking at her. He was looking instead at the man riding toward them from the direction of Callowell, the nearest town, which sat about 4 miles east. "You will not embarrass me. You will not make trouble." Georgia did not say anything. She watched the rider come closer. "You understand me, Georgia," Eldon said, and now he did look at her, and his eyes were flat and impatient in the way they always were when he addressed her. "You are not a young woman of particular appeal or particular skill, and this arrangement is a generous one, more generous than you deserve." Georgia felt the familiar sting of those words move through her the way cold water moves through a person, quick and total, and leaving a chill that settled in the bones. She had heard variations of this speech her whole life. "You are not clever enough. You are not strong enough. You are not useful enough. You are too soft. You ask too many questions. You read when you should be working. You have your mother's dreamy eyes and none of her practical sense, and your mother had precious little of that to begin with. Her mother had died when Georgia was 11, and Georgia had spent the 9 years since trying to be useful enough, trying to be strong enough, trying to earn even a single word of acknowledgement from a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of offering one to her. She had cooked and cleaned and mended and hauled water and helped birth calves at 2 in the morning and ridden fence lines and kept accounts and done everything a woman twice her age and size might have done, and it had never once been enough. And now, at 20 years old, she was being given away. The rider pulled up to the fence, and Georgia looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall in the saddle, she could tell that even before he dismounted, which he did in a single fluid motion that suggested someone entirely comfortable with horses and open land. He wore a dark brown trail coat over a clean shirt, and his hat was a good one, well worn but well kept, pushed back enough that she could see his face. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that carried a few days of stubble and dark eyes that moved first to her father and then immediately, directly, to her. He did not look at her the way her father did. He did not look through her or past her. He looked at her with a kind of attentive stillness, and she did not entirely know what to do with that. "Mr. Wells," the man said, and his voice was low and even. He tied his horse to the post beside the gate and walked forward with his hand extended. "Grant Hadley," Eldon shook his hand. "You're late." "I rode from the Hadley ranch this morning," Grant said without any particular apology in his tone. "It is about 40 miles. I left before dawn." Eldon made a sound that suggested this explanation was barely adequate. "This is Georgia," he said, gesturing at her with the same energy he might have used to point out a fence post that needed repair. "She is not entirely without usefulness in a household. She can cook well enough, she sews. She can read, which I have always thought more trouble than it is worth in a woman, but there it is." Grant Hadley looked at her again. "Miss Wells," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat. There was something in the way he said her name deliberate, like it mattered. "Mr. Hadley," she said quietly. Her father was already moving away. He did not embrace her. He did not wish her well. He picked up her carpetbag and held it out toward Grant Hadley without looking at Georgia again, as though the transaction was already concluded, and she had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way in his life. Grant took the bag. He looked at Eldon for a long moment. Something moved behind his dark eyes, some assessment being made, some conclusion being reached, and then he looked at Georgia. "Do you have anything else you want to bring?" he asked her. Just her, not her father. Georgia blinked. "There is a small box inside," she said, "in my room with some books and some of my mother's things." "Then let us get it," Grant said simply. Her father turned around. "There is no need for." "I will get the box," Grant said, and his voice had not risen and had not sharpened, but there was something in it that was entirely immovable, like bedrock under thin soil, and Eldon Wells, who was not accustomed to being spoken over, seemed to recognize it. He closed his mouth. Georgia led Grant Hadley into the house where she had grown up, through the low front door and past the worn table and the cold fireplace, and up the narrow stairs to the small room at the back that had been hers. The room was plain and close, with a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden she had planted and tended every year since she was 12. The box was on the shelf, a modest thing, pine wood, with a small carved flower on the lid that her mother had made. Georgia reached for it, and Grant was already there beside her, lifting it carefully. "Heavy," he said. "Books," she said. He looked at her, and she thought she saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good," he said. They carried everything out to his horse, and Grant strapped the box behind the saddle with the efficiency of someone who had done 100 similar things, and then he turned and looked at Eldon, who was standing by the fence with his arms crossed. "Mr. Wells," Grant said, "I want to be plain with you about something before Miss Wells and I take our leave." Eldon's eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem with the arrangement?" "No problem with the arrangement," Grant said. "I just want you to know that I intend to treat your daughter with every courtesy and respect. She will want for nothing on my land that I can provide." He paused. "And I would appreciate it if, when you speak of her, you would remember that she is a person of worth." The silence that followed was the strangest thing Georgia had ever heard, a silence that rang, somehow, in the dry Texas air. Her father said nothing. His face had gone somewhere between offended and uncomfortable, which Georgia thought might be the closest he ever came to shame. Grant turned back to Georgia. He had brought a second horse, a steady bay mare with a calm eye tied to the back of his saddle, and he gestured to it now. "She is called Biscuit," he said. "She is gentle. Can you ride?" "Yes," Georgia said. She had always been able to ride. Her father had simply never noticed. She mounted without help. Not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she was 20 years old and entirely capable of mounting a horse, and she had spent long enough in a house where people assumed she could not do things. The mare stood quietly beneath her, warm and solid. She did not look back at her father's house as they rode away. She did not trust herself to. They rode in silence for the first few miles, and Georgia was grateful for it. The land opened up around them the way it always did when you got past the Wells property, wider, somehow, even though it was the same sky and the same red earth. A hawk circled overhead in a long, lazy spiral. The grass whispered. Grant rode about a half-length ahead of her at first, and then he pulled his horse back so they were level, and he glanced over at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question surprised her enough that she almost said yes automatically, the way she always did. But she caught it in her throat and thought about it honestly, and then she said, "I think so. I do not entirely know yet." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. "Fair enough," he said. More silence. But it was a different kind of silence than she had known, not the silence of being ignored or dismissed, but the silence of someone who understood that some things needed time before they needed words. "Mr. Hadley," she said after a while. "Grant," he said, "please." She tried it in her mind for a moment. "Grant, can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," he said, and he said it simply, like a fact. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. "My father is not a wealthy man, and I know he offered you nothing of value in this arrangement. He told me the arrangement was generous to me. He did not explain what was generous about it for you." Grant was quiet for a moment. A jackrabbit bolted from a clump of dry grass near the trail, and his horse barely flicked an ear. He watched the horizon for a breath or two, and then he said, "My mother knew your mother. They were friends a long time ago, before your family moved to the panhandle, before your mother passed. He said it gently, the last part. My mother told me things about your mother, that she was kind and sharp-minded, and that she had a daughter who took after her. When I heard what your father was planning to do, I made a different arrangement with him than the one he thinks he made. Georgia looked at him. What does that mean? It means that your father believes he traded you away in the way that men sometimes do, in exchange for the deed to a parcel of land he wanted on the eastern edge of my property, Grant said. And I did give him that deed because it was not worth much to me and because it was the only way to get him to let you go. But you are not cattle, Miss Wells. Georgia, you are not a thing to be traded. He paused. What you are is a woman who deserves to decide her own life. So when we get to the Hadley ranch, what happens next is your choice. I have a ranch house with a spare room and a cook named Mrs. Aldridge who has been with my family for 20 years and who will see to it that everything is proper. You can stay as long as you need to figure out what you want. I am not going to make demands of you. Georgia stared at him. The horse beneath her plodded along steadily, and the sun moved across the sky, and she stared at this man who had ridden 40 miles before dawn to take her away from a father who had called her useless, and she did not know what to say. Why? She finally managed. Grant glanced at her, and there it was, the smile she had almost seen earlier, fuller now, a little crooked on one side, and it changed his face entirely, made it warmer and younger somehow. Because somebody should have done it a long time ago, he said. They stopped at midday beside a creek that ran shallow and clear over flat limestone, and Grant had packed food, cornbread wrapped in cloth, smoked meat, dried apricots, and they ate in the shade of a cottonwood while the horses drank. Georgia ate with more appetite than she had felt in months, which surprised her. She supposed that leaving a place that had never wanted you could do that. Tell me about your ranch, she said. His face did a thing she was beginning to recognize, a slight settling, like a man coming home from a distance. The Hadley place is about 30 sections, give or take, he said. My father built the first structures about 25 years ago. He passed 3 years back. My mother is still there. She is the one who really runs things, if you ask me, though she would never admit it. A pause. We run cattle, have a good remuda of horses. The east pasture has some of the finest grass in the county when the rain cooperates, which it does not always do. Who works it? I have 5 good hands, he said. Tom Reeves, who has been with us since before I was born and who has opinions about everything and is usually right. Brothers named Carter and Dill Marsh, who bicker like tomcats but work well together. A man named Paco Delgado, whose family has ranched this part of Texas since before it was Texas, and he knows more about cattle and land than any 3 other men I can name. And a young fellow named Eddie Burrows, who is 17 and learning fast. He looked at her sideways. They are decent men. You will not have trouble from any of them. I have had trouble managed my whole life, Georgia said, and then she was surprised at herself for saying it. She had not meant to say something that vulnerable, but Grant did not flinch from it. I know, he said quietly. I think that is over now. She wanted to believe him. She was not yet sure she could, but she wanted to. The Hadley ranch came into view in the late afternoon when the light had gone gold and long-shadowed, and the land was at its most beautiful. The main house was a solid, well-built thing of limestone and timber, 2 stories with a wide front porch that wrapped around on both sides, and there were good outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a kitchen garden that made George's breath catch because it was full and carefully tended and blooming in a dozen different greens. There was a woman on the porch. She was perhaps 55, compact and straight-backed, with white hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat and keen eyes that took in both riders at once. She came down the porch steps with a quick, decisive step and stopped at the fence gate, and she looked at Georgia with an expression that was not an assessment so much as a recognition, like she was seeing something she had expected and was glad to see. You must be Mattie Wells's girl, she said. Georgia felt something in her chest move that had not moved in a very long time. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I am Georgia." The woman reached up and took her hand and held it in both of hers, and her grip was warm and firm. "I am Ruth Hadley," she said. "I have thought about you for years. Welcome home. Welcome home, 2 words." Georgia had to look at the horizon for a moment so that nothing embarrassing happened to her face. Grant dismounted smoothly and came around to help Georgia down, and she led him this time, not because she could not manage alone, but because he offered with his hand out and his eyes quiet, and there was nothing in the gesture except genuine care. And she was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, to receive that. His hand was warm and steady under hers. Ruth Hadley saw to it that George's carpetbag and box were carried upstairs to a room that was clean and bright, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that had been made from what looked like 100 different fabrics and colors. There was a small writing desk under the window and a shelf along one wall, empty and waiting. "For your books," Ruth said, nodding at the shelf as she set George's mother's box down carefully on the desk. Georgia looked around the room and then she looked at Ruth and she said, "Mrs. Hadley, I want to be useful here. I do not want to be a burden. I can cook and mend and keep accounts and work a garden," and Ruth held up a hand, not unkindly. "You are not a burden," she said firmly, "and you will have plenty of time to show me what you can do. Tonight you will eat supper and rest. The work will still be there in the morning, I promise you that." Supper that evening was at a long table in the kitchen. The big formal dining room, Ruth explained, was reserved for holidays and company, and this was neither. And it was a real meal, a proper one. Beef stew and fresh cornbread and canned tomatoes and coffee so good that Georgia wrapped both hands around the mug and felt it down to her feet. Mrs. Aldridge, the cook, was a round-faced woman of about 50 with quick hands and a sharp wit, and she looked Georgia over when she first came into the kitchen and then said, "She is thin. We will fix that," and went back to stirring the stew with the satisfied air of someone who had just added a task to a list and already knew how to complete it. Grant was at supper, and the 5 ranch hands came in clean and quiet and took their places at the long table with an easy familiarity that told Georgia a lot about how this household ran. Tom Reeves was exactly as Grant had described, old and weathered and full of opinions, which he offered at the table with such good humor that it was hard to take offense at any of them. The Marsh brothers argued briefly about whether Tuesday or Wednesday had been the hotter day, and everyone else ignored them with the practiced patience of long familiarity. Paco Delgado was a quiet man with careful dark eyes who nodded to Georgia with a respect that was old and genuine. Eddie Burrows looked at Georgia with the faint awkwardness of a very young man who had been told to behave, and was trying hard to remember what that looked like. Grant sat at the head of the table, and Georgia sat to Ruth's right, which was near enough the middle that she could see everyone. She ate and listened and said little, but she felt, with a peculiar and unfamiliar certainty, that she was in a place where listening was valued, and where saying little was not the same thing as being dismissed. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Aldridge had begun the washing up, Ruth took Georgia onto the front porch and they sat in the chairs there and watched the stars come out over the panhandle. "He is a good man," Ruth said without preamble. "My son. He has always been a good man. His father was too, God rest him. But Grant has a wider heart, I think. He carries things." Georgia looked at her. "He told me that you knew my mother." "I did," Ruth said. "Maddie and I grew up in the same town in Oklahoma before either of us had husbands or land or sorrows. She was the finest woman I have ever known, and she chose a man who did not deserve her, and I always regretted that I did not say so louder when I had the chance." Ruth's voice was even, but her eyes were not. "I heard over the years how things were on the Wells property. I should have done something sooner." "You did something now," Georgia said. Ruth looked at her then with an expression that was complicated and warm and sad all at once. "Grant did something now," she said. "I just told him the truth about you." Georgia thought about that for a long moment. The stars were thickening above the panhandle, the great wide canopy of them that you could only really see this far from any town. "What truth?" she asked. "That you were worth knowing," Ruth said simply. "That you were worth going after." The first weeks on the Hadley ranch were, for Georgia, a kind of bewildering education in what it felt like to be in a place where her presence was considered a good thing. She had braced herself for conditions, for Grant to reveal, gradually, what he actually expected from this arrangement, for the courtesy to peel back and expose something harder underneath, the way her father's rare moments of approval had always eventually done. She waited for it the way you wait for a crack of thunder after lightning, tensed and certain it was coming. It did not come. Instead, what came was a Tuesday morning in early May, when she came downstairs before anyone else, and started the breakfast because Mrs. Aldridge's hands were swollen from the cold that had crept in overnight, and Grant came in from the pre-dawn barn work to find the table set and the eggs scrambled and the coffee made, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He sat down and ate and did not say much else, but there was a quality to his silence that she was beginning to understand. He was not ignoring her. He was thinking. And later that morning, when she was at the kitchen garden that she had quietly begun to reorganize, it was good, but she could see ways to make it better. He came and stood at the edge of it and watched her for a moment and then said, "You have your mother's eye for growing things." She looked up. "You knew her." "I was about 10 the last time I saw her," he said. "She came through with your father before you were born, or maybe just after. I remember she had very blue eyes and she kept a sketch book and she drew pictures of everything she saw." He paused. "Do you draw?" Georgia sat back on her heels. "Yes," she said, and she was slightly astonished by the admission because she had not told anyone about the drawing in years, because the last time she had shown her father a sketch he had said it was a waste of paper. Something shifted in Grant's expression. "I thought you might," he said. She did not know what to do with him. That was the problem, or rather, it was not a problem, but it required her to learn a new way of thinking about people, and that was not quick work. She had been taught, over 20 years, that the world was fundamentally indifferent to her at best and actively dismissive at worst, and here was a man who asked her questions, and remembered her answers, and treated her ideas as if they had weight. At the end of her second week, a situation arose in Callowell that required Grant to go into town, and he asked Georgia if she would like to come. She said yes before she had time to think about it, and then spent the ride trying to prepare herself for whatever her father might have told people. Callowell was not a large town, perhaps 300 people, a main street of perhaps 8 establishments of varying legitimacy and permanence, a church and a school and a land office, and a saloon called the Long Acre. People knew people here the way people always did in small places. The first person they encountered who mattered was a woman named Clara Finch, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and who had known Eldon Wells for 20 years. She looked at Georgia with a very particular expression when Grant introduced her, an expression that had curiosity and a trace of pity in it, which Georgia recognized and did not appreciate. "I heard your father made an arrangement," Clara said carefully. She was a careful woman in her 50s, not unkind but not far from it. "Miss Wells is living at the Hadley ranch," Grant said, pleasantly and clearly. "She has been an enormous help to my mother and has the finest kitchen garden I have ever seen taking shape in the back field. We needed wire and seed, and I thought she should come and choose what she wanted for it herself." Clara Finch blinked. Then she looked at Georgia with a different expression, recalibrating. Georgia could see it happening. "Your mother was a fine woman," Clara said after a moment. "I always thought so." "Thank you," Georgia said. On the walk back to the horses, Georgia said to Grant, "You did not have to do that." "Do what?" he said. "Tell her what you told her, about the garden and choosing things myself. You could have just said I was helping out." "But you are not just helping out," Grant said, as though this was entirely self-evident. "You reorganized the cold cellar and it is twice as efficient as it was." You figured out that the south fence line on the lower pasture has been losing posts, and you told Tom where to look before he even started. You put together a better accounting method for the feed costs in an afternoon than the one I had been using for 2 years. He looked at her steadily. Georgia, someone has been lying to you. She stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead, and turned to look at her, and the main street of Callowell went on around them. A wagon rattling past, a dog crossing in front of the land office, the sound of hammering from somewhere down the block. But Georgia was standing very still and feeling something inside her that was enormous and fragile all at once. "What?" she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Someone has been lying to you," he said again, and his voice was gentle, but his eyes were not. They were serious and certain and direct. "Your whole life. Someone told you that you were not clever or capable or worth anything, and I do not know how a person does that to their own child, but I know that it is a lie because I have watched you for 2 weeks and I can see exactly what you are." "What am I?" she whispered. "You are the sharpest person on my ranch," he said. "You are patient and precise, and you observe things that most people miss entirely. You are kind to Mrs. Aldridge when her hands are bad, and you remembered that Eddie takes his coffee with more sugar than is strictly necessary, and you made sure there was enough of it without being asked. You know plants and animals and weather and numbers, and you read 3 books in 2 weeks from the shelf in the sitting room, and you put them back with the spines facing out so other people could find them easily." He stopped. "And you draw. I would like to see your drawings someday if you are willing." Georgia looked at the street, at the dust and the buildings and the flat Texas sky above the rooftops, and she breathed very carefully because she did not want to cry on the main street of Callowell, Texas. "You cannot say things like that to me," she said finally, her voice slightly unsteady. "Why not?" he said. "Because I do not know what to do with them." He was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him his expression was that particular mixture of warm and serious that she was beginning to realize was simply his face when he was being honest. "You do not have to do anything with them," he said. "They are just true." They bought their wire and their seed and rode back to the ranch in the long afternoon light, and Georgia spent the ride turning his words over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and edges. Summer came on fast, the way Texas summers did, rolling in like a fire that started at the horizon and consumed everything between here and there by noon. The work on the ranch intensified with the season, and Georgia found herself part of it in ways she had not anticipated, and that she discovered she loved fiercely out in the kitchen garden in the early morning before the heat came down, riding fence lines with Paco Delgado, who taught her things about the land that she filed away like treasures, helping with the books in the evenings on the front porch with the ledger open in her lap, while Grant sat nearby with the weekly reports from the hands. They fell into a rhythm that felt, Georgia thought one evening, as natural as breathing. She would bring 2 cups of coffee out and set one near him and take the rocking chair to his left, and they would work in companionable quiet, and occasionally one of them would say something and the other would consider it and respond, and it was nothing like any version of human company she had previously experienced. He had asked to see her drawings, and she had eventually, after several weeks of internal debate, brought her sketchbook down one evening. He looked through it slowly. He did not say anything for a long time. She watched his face and she was frightened. She realized actually frightened, the way you are frightened when something matters. The sketches were her real thoughts, her real self, rendered in pencil on paper, her mother's face from memory, the hawk she had watched circling over the creek on the day she left her father's property, the view from her childhood window that she had drawn a dozen times because looking at it through drawing was the only way she had of making peace with it, the Hadley ranch house as she had first seen it in the evening light. Grant turned to that last one and stopped. "You drew this the first evening," he said. It was not quite a question. "From memory, the next morning," she said. "I sat at the desk in the room you gave me and drew it before I came downstairs." He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to the one before it, his mother's kitchen garden, drawn with close attention to every plant, every row, every tool leaning against the fence. Then the one before that, which was Tom Reeves's face, caught in profile when he had been watching the sunset from the top rail of the corral fence on her third evening at the ranch, his expression philosophical and content. "Georgia," Grant said. "I know they are not," she began. "They are extraordinary," he said. His voice was quiet and completely sure. She stopped speaking. He looked at her over the sketchbook. "These are extraordinary," he said again. "The one of Tom, that is exactly him. That is exactly the way he looks when he is watching the evening come in. How did you see that so clearly on your third day here?" She did not entirely know how to answer that. "I have always watched people," she said. "It was, at my father's house, it was useful to understand what kind of mood a person was in before they knew you were paying attention." Something passed over Grant's face, pain, quickly controlled. He looked back at the sketchbook and turned the pages again, more slowly this time. "Your mother's face," he said, reaching the portrait. "Yes, I can see the resemblance," he said softly. "You have her eyes." Georgia said nothing, but she did not look away. He closed the sketchbook and held it out to her with both hands, with a careful deliberateness that she understood was respect for what it contained. "Thank you for showing me," he said. She took it. Their fingers touched briefly over the cover of the book, and she felt that touch all the way up her arm, and she looked down quickly and then away at the darkening sky over the pasture. "Do you do anything that is not remarkable?" he asked, and his voice had changed lighter, with the warmth that was becoming familiar. "I burned the cornbread last Thursday," she said. He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, and it startled a mockingbird out of the mesquite bush at the edge of the porch. And Georgia looked at him with something in her expression that she did not entirely intend to be there. It was the 4th of July when Georgia first understood with complete clarity what was happening to her. They had ridden out to the higher ground north of the main pasture to watch the fireworks that the people of Callowell set off every year from the river bend, small by any great city standards, but bright against the enormous panhandle sky, and the whole ranch had ridden out, Ruth and Mrs. Aldridge in the wagon and everyone else on horseback, and they had spread blankets on the hillside and eaten a cold supper and waited for the dark. The fireworks, when they came, were red and white and gold against the black sky, popping and trailing sparks, and the horses shifted but stood because they were good horses, and the ranch hands watched with easy pleasure. Georgia was sitting on her blanket with her knees drawn up, and Grant was beside her close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and she was looking at the sky when one of the bigger bursts went up, spreading wide and bright, and she made a small, involuntary sound of pleasure. She glanced at him immediately after, a little embarrassed at herself, and found him watching her instead of the sky. In the light of the fireworks, that shifting, brilliant, brief light, his expression was open in a way that she had not seen before. Not guarded, not careful, just open, just him looking at her. She looked away quickly, back at the sky, and she could hear her own heartbeat. After a while she said, without looking at him, "You were not watching the fireworks." "No," he said, "that was all." Just no, simple and honest and entirely devastating to her composure. She said nothing else. The fireworks continued. The night smelled of dry grass and gunpowder and warm horses, and Grant was warm beside her with their shoulders almost but not quite touching. And Georgia Wells sat under the 4th of July sky in 1874 and recognized that she was falling in love with this man, and the recognition was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. A week later, her father came to the ranch. She saw the horse from the kitchen garden before she saw the man, and she knew the horse a dun with a white blaze that her father had owned for years. She straightened up from the row she was weeding, and her hands went still, and her stomach turned over. Eldon Wells rode up to the front gate and dismounted, and Grant was already coming around the corner of the barn because he had apparently seen the rider too, and he came with a calm, unhurried stride that Georgia recognized as the one he used when he was particularly alert. "Wells," Grant said. Eldon looked at Georgia first, and his expression was the one she knew, flat assessment, finding her wanting. Then he looked at Grant. "I wanted to talk about the eastern parcel," he said. There is an issue with the deed. There is no issue with the deed, Grant said. I think there may be a surveying problem, Eldon said. The eastern boundary line. Had it surveyed by Jim Tarbell last week, Grant said. The deed is correct. The land is yours as agreed. Eldon's eyes moved back to Georgia. She met his gaze because she had learned slowly in the last months that she did not have to be the first one to look away. How are you getting on, he said, and the question sounded strange coming from him, like a door being tried that had never been opened. Well, she said. Thank you. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Not quite guilt. Her father had never been a man who was fluent in guilt, but something adjacent to it. Something that might be, under better circumstances, the beginning of it. Good, he said. The word landed flat and inadequate. Is there anything else I can help you with? Grant said, and his voice was still pleasant, still even, but Georgia heard the thing underneath it, the firmness, the unmistakable message that this visit would be brief. Eldon seemed to hear it too. He looked at Georgia one more time. Your mother, he said, would be. He stopped. Georgia waited. She would be glad you are here, he said, and it came out rough like something pulled through gravel. Then he got back on his horse and rode away. Georgia stood in the kitchen garden for a long moment after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Grant came to stand nearby, not close enough to crowd her but present. Are you all right? He asked. His second instinct with her always was that question. I think so, she said. Then, he said she would be glad. She would be, Grant said. I am quite certain of that. She pressed her lips together. Then she bent back down to her weeding because she needed something to do with her hands. Grant stayed for a few minutes without speaking, leaning on the fence post at the garden edge, and she was not sure if he was watching the horizon or watching her, but his presence was steady, and she found that she could breathe properly again. Later that afternoon, she found him at the corral working a young horse, a gray 3-year-old with more energy than sense. He was patient with it in the way he was patient with everything, not forcing, not fighting, but asking and waiting and asking again, until the horse understood what was being requested. She stood at the fence and watched him for a while, and she thought about the way he had looked at her the night of the fireworks, and she thought about the way he said her name, and she thought about every small, careful way he had shown her, over months, that she was valued and seen and wanted. She thought about the fact that she was 20 years old, and that her whole previous life had been one long catalog of being told what she could not do and was not worth, and that she had arrived at this place with one carpetbag and a box of books and almost no working knowledge of how to receive kindness, and that this man had given her the time and the space to learn it without once making her feel as though she was doing it wrong. She thought, I love him. She thought, I have been falling in love with him since he told that taciturn woman in the dry goods store that I chose my own seed. She pressed her hands flat on the top rail of the fence and watched him work the gray horse through a figure 8 in the dust of the corral, and she thought, what do I do with this? What she did, initially, was nothing. She continued the routine of the ranch, the garden, the books, the rides, the suppers, the front porch evenings. But she was more aware of him now in a way that was constant and low-grade and alive, like the hum of a telegraph wire, and she suspected from certain moments. The way he met her eyes a half-second longer than necessary, the way he sometimes came to find her when she had been out of sight for an hour, the way he had once, helping her down from Biscuit, held her hand for a beat too long, and then released it like a man releasing something he had to make himself let go. That the awareness was not hers alone. It was Ruth who finally said something. They were in the kitchen in late August, working on preserves peaches from the small orchard at the south end of the property, and Ruth, stirring the pot with the efficiency of long practice, said without looking up, My son has not been the same since you came. Georgia kept her eyes on the peaches she was cutting. How do you mean? He laughs more, Ruth said simply. He was always a serious boy, a good boy but serious. His father was the same way, carried the weight of things. Since you came, there is a lightness. She paused. He asks me in the evening when I see him before bed whether you seemed happy today, whether I thought you were settling in well. He never used to ask me about anyone that way." Georgia set down her knife. She stared at the peach halves in the bowl in front of her. "I think you know," Ruth said, still without looking up. "I think you have known for a while. I just thought someone should say it plainly." "I do not want to," Georgia started. "What?" Ruth said. "Love him, Georgia." She finally looked up, and her expression was fond and firm and very direct. "Your mother spent her life being afraid to want what she wanted because she had been told she did not deserve it. Do not make the same mistake." Georgia picked up her knife again. She did not say anything else. But when the preserves were done and cooling in their jars on the shelf, she went out to the front porch and sat in the evening light and thought about courage, which was something she had in considerable quantities when it came to work and weather and difficult men and unknown horses, and which apparently went sideways when it came to this. The opportunity, when it came simply. It was a September evening, cool enough for the first time that the porch was pleasant again after the brutal summer. Grant had been out since before dawn dealing with a fence situation on the North Range, one of the wire breaks that happened in late summer, nothing dramatic but demanding, and he came back in the early evening covered in dust and tired in the shoulders but not in the eyes. Georgia brought coffee out as she usually did, and she set his cup down beside him, and she went to take her chair, and he said, "Georgia." She turned. He was holding something out to her, a small piece of paper folded. She looked at it and then at him, and his expression was careful and open and slightly nervous in a way she had never seen on him before, which she found, irrationally, terrifying. She took the paper and opened it. It was a sketch, done in pencil in a hand that was not practiced but was sincere, a simple drawing of a woman sitting in a rocking chair on a porch, her head bent over a book, her hair loose at the back where a pin had slipped, a coffee cup on the rail beside her and the evening sky behind her full of the first stars. It was her. He had drawn her. She looked up from the paper and he was watching her with that expression, careful, open, entirely unguarded. "I am not skilled at it the way you are," he said, "but I wanted to try." A pause. "Because you do that, you draw people so that I can see what you see when you look at them. And I wanted to show you what I see when I look at you." Georgia looked down at the drawing again. She saw what he had tried to show her, not prettiness, not usefulness, not a woman who was adequate or tolerable or barely worthy of the space she occupied. Just a person, peaceful and whole and present in the evening on a porch that was hers. "Grant," she said, and her voice did something she had not entirely authorized it to do. "I know I came into your life in a peculiar way," he said, and now he was standing up from his chair, and the evening was soft around them, the first cool breath of September moving through the mesquite. "And I know that you have had a year of trying to figure out who you are, outside of everything you were told about yourself, and I do not want to press you or put demands on you that you are not ready for." He paused. "But I also think that you should know that I am in love with you. I have been for some time. And if that is something you want nothing to do with, I will understand it and nothing will change between us. You have my word. But if—" "Grant," she said more firmly, and she closed the distance between them, and she put her hand on the lapel of his trail coat because she needed something solid to hold onto, and she looked at him from a distance of perhaps 18 inches and said, "Stop talking." Something moved in his face, startlement, relief. And then that smile, the crooked one that lived more on the left side, the one she had been filing away since the first day. "All right," he said softly. She reached up with her other hand and pulled him down by the front of that coat and kissed him. And he kissed her back immediately, and with complete certainty, and both of his arms came around her, and she felt, standing on that porch in the September evening in 1874, that she was entirely and precisely where she was supposed to be, and that this feeling was so different from every feeling she had been raised on that it was almost a new sense entirely. When they separated, she kept her forehead against his chin for a moment and said quietly, "I am in love with you too." In case that was not clear from she gestured vaguely. It was tolerably clear, he said into her hair, and she could feel him smiling. Ruth Hadley heard about it the following morning when Georgia came downstairs and Grant was already at the table, and the expression on both their faces made Mrs. Aldridge turn from the stove and raise an eyebrow at Ruth, who raised her coffee cup in a small, satisfied toast to no one in particular. Tom Reeves, who was in the kitchen to report on the North Range and who observed things even when you thought he was not, said to Grant on the way out, "Well, took you long enough," and walked back toward the barn without waiting for a response. The courtship was, given that it occurred between two adults who were already living on the same property, and who already knew each other with a thoroughness that most courting couples did not achieve in twice the time, both shorter and richer than convention might have expected. They rode together every morning that the work allowed, and the rides grew longer as September deepened, and the land turned to its autumn colors, the grasses going gold and amber and rust, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look like the best version of itself. They talked about everything, her childhood and his, her mother and his father, books and land and cattle and the future of the Texas panhandle, the small daily machinery of the ranch and the large philosophical questions of how to live, and Grant turned out to have thoughts about all of it that were worth hearing. He had read widely, his mother had seen to that, and he asked questions with a genuine curiosity that she had never encountered in a man before. He asked her what she thought about things. He listened to her answers. When she said something he had not considered, he considered it visibly, and sometimes he said she was right, and sometimes he said she had changed how he saw something. And once, over a disagreement about the best way to manage the creek pasture through the dry season, he argued his position with such thoughtful tenacity that she held her position just as firmly, and they ended up riding back to the ranch in the comfortable silence of two people who had tried each other's minds and found them worthy of the effort. He had that slight smile on when they got back to the barn, and she said, "What?" And he said, "I like arguing with you," and she said, "That is a very strange thing to like," and he said, "I like it because you are as likely to be right as I am, and that is not something I can say about many people," and she had to look away to manage her expression. He proposed on an October morning in the kitchen garden, which was going to its autumn sleep and looked bare and a little melancholy and entirely right to Georgia, who had always thought that the bare garden was beautiful too because it was full of potential. He did it without theater. He was not a theatrical man, but he had clearly thought about it carefully, because what he said was specific and considered and left no ambiguity about what he meant and why. He said that he wanted to marry her because she was the person he wanted beside him for every part of this life. The work and the worry and the good evenings on the porch, and the arguments about creek pastures, and the mornings when everything went sideways and the long quiet rides when everything was fine. He said that he wanted her to have the full standing of this place, not as a guest or a charity or an arrangement, but as its partner. He said that he thought she was extraordinary, and that the fact that she was only beginning to believe it herself was something he intended to spend the rest of his life proving, if she would let him. Georgia listened to all of it with her arms crossed and her hands tucked under her elbows because she was cold, and she was looking at the bare garden beds, and when he finished she said, "Yes," and then she turned and looked at him and said it again, because the first one might have come out a bit muffled. They were married in November in the Callowell church, with Ruth and Mrs. Aldridge and all 5 ranch hands and a number of townspeople who had, in the months of George's residence, come to know her and been surprised by her in various ways that Clara Finch from the dry goods store had apparently told people about extensively, and with revision of her earlier opinions. The minister was a solid, kind man named Brother Daniel, who had been in this part of Texas for 15 years, and who conducted the ceremony with warmth and appropriate brevity. Georgia wore a dress that Ruth had helped her make blue wool with white trim at the cuffs and collar, nothing extravagant but well-made and exactly right. And she carried a small bunch of dried flowers from the kitchen garden, because Mrs. Aldridge had pressed them in August against just such a need, which made Georgia laugh when she found out. Grant, beside her at the altar, looked at her the way he had looked at her in the fireworks light, open and unguarded, and she looked back at him the same way because she had learned, in the months since she had come to this place with one carpetbag and a box of books, that being seen was not something to be afraid of when the person doing the seeing was this man. Her father was not there. She had considered inviting him. She had thought about it for several days, walking the fence lines and the garden, working through what it would mean. In the end, she had written him a letter not angry, not punishing, but honest. She told him that she was marrying Grant Hadley and that she was well and happy. She told him that she hoped he was well. She did not invite him because she did not think his presence would be a kind thing on a day that she wanted to be entirely kind. She told him that she bore him no hatred. She told him that she wished he could have seen her the way others had learned to see her, and that she had stopped waiting for it, and that she was choosing to go forward. She never received a reply. She had not entirely expected one, but the letter had needed to be written, and she had written it, and it was done. What she had not expected was to receive, 3 days after the wedding, a letter from one of her brothers. The second one, Daniel, who was 25 and had always been, of the three, the one who came closest to being kind to her. It was a short letter, written in the blunt style of a man who was not accustomed to writing letters for emotional reasons, but it said that he had heard she was married, and that he was glad she seemed to have landed well, and that he had always thought their father was wrong about her, and that he was sorry he had not said so louder. Georgia read that letter 3 times. Then she put it in her mother's box, with the sketch book and the carved flower lid, and she set the box on the shelf that was now full of her books, in the room that was now hers and Grant's, in the house that was now hers as completely as it was anyone's. She did not cry, but she sat with it for a long time. Winter on the panhandle was not gentle. The blue northers came down out of the Llano Estacado with a comprehensiveness that respected no fence line and no plan, and the work in winter was not lighter than the work in summer, only different checking on livestock in the cold, keeping pipes from freezing, ensuring the hands in the bunkhouse were provisioned and warm, riding out in conditions that would stop a less committed person. Georgia took to winter ranch work with the same attentiveness she brought to everything, and she found that she was not afraid of cold weather and long rides, and the raw particular satisfaction of getting an animal through a hard night. Grant watched her and said nothing dramatic about it, which was its own kind of tribute. But one bitter December morning when they had both been out since before light handling a situation with the North herd, and they came back in cold and tired with ice in their scarves and sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Aldridge pressed hot coffee into their hands, he looked at her across the table and said, "My father would have liked you very much." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "I would have liked him too, from what you have told me. He was a plain-dealing man," Grant said. "He said what he meant and he valued the same in others. He worked hard and he expected everyone around him to work hard, but he never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself." A pause. "He always said the ranch was not worth anything without the right people in it." "He was right," Georgia said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the winter morning, and she thought, This is the life. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, just this. 2 people who have chosen each other, warming their hands on coffee cups after a hard morning, in a house that is full and solid and real." Spring came back with its particular extravagance, and with it a discovery that Georgia received with a mixture of joy and terror that she supposed was universal. She told Grant on a Tuesday evening on the front porch, because that was their place for honesty, and he went very still for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was carefully controlled but could not quite contain what was underneath it, "Are you certain?" "Mrs. Aldridge agrees with me," Georgia said, which was as close to certain as things got on the Hadley ranch. Grant said nothing for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and came to where she was sitting and knelt down in front of her, which was not at all a usual thing for him to do, and which made her heart do something complicated, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded it nearly undid her entirely. "Are you all right?" he said. His first question always. "I am wonderful," she said, which was true and also funny when she thought about it, and she could see from the shift in his expression that he was doing the math on how remarkable it was that she could say that without hesitation. "Good," he said. He pressed her hands between his. "Good." Ruth Hadley, when informed, wept briefly and without shame, and then went directly to planning, which was the most Ruth thing that could have happened, and which Georgia found deeply comforting. The pregnancy was straightforward in the way that Georgia was coming to understand most things in her life to be. Not easy, because easy was not really the point, but manageable, with effort and good support, and the particular comfort of being in a place where people looked after you not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She kept working through most of it, because she was not a woman who sat still easily, and because the work satisfied her, though she and Grant renegotiated certain aspects of the work as the months progressed, and the negotiations were conducted with the same thoughtful attention they brought to everything, which meant they disagreed twice and found their way through both disagreements, and she won one and he won one, and it was generally fine. She drew through the pregnancy too. She drew the ranch in every season, and she drew Grant, and she drew Ruth, and she drew the hands and the horses and the kitchen garden, and the way the sky looked at all different hours. When she ran out of room in her old sketch book, Grant came home from Callowell with 3 new ones, and she looked at them sitting on the desk, and felt a warmth that she could not have adequately described, but that had something to do with being known. He had also brought, from the land office in Callowell, a framed map of the property which he hung in the front room with her name next to his on the deed notation at the bottom, because he had had it formally registered months ago and had been waiting for the right frame. She made him explain the framing choice, and he said it had taken him 3 trips to find one that was the right size, which was so specific and so like him that she went and stood very close to him for a long moment, and did not say anything because nothing she could say was sufficient. Their son was born in October of 1875 in the limestone ranch house, with Ruth holding one of George's hands and Mrs. Aldridge managing the proceedings with the authority of someone who had done this before, and was not going to let anything go wrong on her watch. Grant was in the next room because that was what was done, but Georgia could hear him through the door, the pacing that she recognized by its rhythm, and when the baby was cleaned and wrapped and Georgia was settled and the door was opened, he was in the room in an instant. He looked at the baby with the expression of a man confronting something too large and too real to process quickly. He looked at Georgia with the expression of a man who has been given something he understands he does not deserve, but is going to spend the rest of his life being grateful for. She held the baby out to him. "Come and meet your son," she said. Grant took him with the care of someone handling something precious, and he looked down at the small, red, wrinkled face with those dark, attentive eyes, and the baby looked back at him with the unfocused, profound interest of the newly arrived, and Grant said, very quietly, "Hello." Then he looked at Georgia and she saw his eyes were wet, which was a thing she had not seen before and which she felt would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Are you all right?" she said, borrowing his question. "More than I have words for," he said. They named him James Hadley for Grant's father, and they called him Jamie from the first day. The years that followed were full. They were full in the way that a life built deliberately is full, not without difficulty, because difficulty was the nature of ranching in the Texas panhandle, and the nature of people, and the nature of any 2 strong-willed people sharing a life, but rich with the kind of substance that makes difficulty worthwhile. There were good years and lean years. There was a terrible drought in 1876 that tested every person on the Hadley property and required every ounce of planning and resourcefulness that Georgia and Grant collectively possessed. And there was a flood the following spring that proved, in the particularly twisted logic of the panhandle, to be a kind of recovery. There was a hard winter in 1878 that Georgia catalogued in her sketch books with the precision and care she brought to everything. The drawings of ice-rimed fence posts and snow-covered pastures becoming, over time, a kind of visual history of the place and its weathers. Jamie grew from a small and startlingly alert infant into a boy who combined Grant's steadiness with Georgia's observational precision, in a way that delighted both his parents and exasperated Tom Reeves, who said on several occasions that the child saw too much for his own good, which Paco Delgado said was perhaps the finest thing you could say about a person. When Jamie was 3, Georgia discovered she was pregnant again, and this time there was no mixture of joy and terror, just joy, straightforward and complete, though she noted to Grant that the terror had been quite reasonable the first time, and she was not taking sole credit for it. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1879, and they named her Maddie Matilda Ruth, properly, for both grandmothers. And she arrived with considerably more force of personality than the law of small persons seemed to require, which made Ruth Hadley laugh for about 20 seconds straight when she held her for the first time. Ruth had more than enough energy and wit to manage being a grandmother, but there was a quieting in her in those years that Georgia watched with the attentiveness she brought to all the things she loved. Ruth was healthy, but she was getting older, and she transferred more and more of the household management to Georgia without fanfare, and with a satisfaction that was entirely real. They had the relationship that Georgia had never had with her own father, one of genuine mutual respect and affection, in which Ruth offered wisdom without imposition, and Georgia offered care without condescension, and both of them knew, without ever saying it directly, that this was something rare. Georgia's brother Daniel wrote occasionally, and she wrote back, and the correspondence was not close, but it was honest, and over several years it became something of value on both sides. He came to visit once, in the summer of 1878, and the visit was somewhat awkward in the way that visits are when they are the first after a long estrangement and several years of letter writing. But he sat at the long kitchen table and ate Mrs. Aldridge's food and looked at the kitchen garden and the well-run buildings and his sister's face, and Georgia could see him recalibrating, the same way Clara Finch had recalibrated years before, and at the end of the visit he stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and said, "You seem well, Georgia. You seem yourself." She thought about what that meant, coming from someone who had grown up in the same house with her and had seen the version of her that had been diminished and dismissed. She thought about what it meant that she was now recognizable to herself. "I am," she said. "I really am." He rode away and she stood at the gate for a moment, and then Grant was beside her, not touching her, just present, the way he had been on that first day when she stood in the garden after her father's visit. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and she meant it entirely. She heard through Daniel's letters that her father had taken ill in 1879. She received the information with a complicated quietness that she sat with honestly. She did not go to him. She had made her peace with him in the letter she had written, and she believed he had received it, and she believed that was the extent of what they had to say to each other. When he died in the late autumn of 1879, she was not at the Wells property, and she did not go to the burial. She sat on the front porch of the Hadley ranch in the November evening and let herself feel what she felt, which was grief not for what she had lost, but for what had never been and could not now ever be, for the father he might have been if he had been capable of it. Grant sat with her. He did not say much. He had learned over 5 years when she needed words and when she needed presence, and this was a presence evening, and he was steady beside her in the dark and the cold, and after a while she said, "I am all right," and she was. The ranch grew through the early 1880s. Grant made careful decisions about expansion, not aggressive, not reckless, but thoughtful and well-informed. And Georgia was part of every major discussion because she was part of every major decision. And the bookkeeping system she had devised in her first months had by now been adopted by at least 3 other ranches in the county who had seen it and asked about it, and which Tom Reeves referred to as Georgia's system, with an air of proprietary pride that was entirely unjustified and entirely dear. Paco Delgado's nephew came to work the ranch in 1880, a young man of 20 named Ernesto who had his uncle's quiet competence and an additional talent for horses that quickly made him invaluable. Eddie Burrows, no longer 17 but 23, had by this point become a solid hand and a good man who was beginning to have his own opinions about things, and who argued them in the kitchen table discussions with a growing confidence that Grant and Georgia both encouraged, because it was the mark of someone finding their own ground. Tom Reeves retired in the summer of 1882 at the age of about 65. He had never been entirely sure of his own birth year, and did so in the way he did everything, with opinions and no particular fuss. He was given the use of a small house on the south edge of the property for as long as he wanted it, which Grant offered, and Tom accepted with the gruff satisfaction of a man who had not expected to be surprised by generosity at his age. He continued to offer opinions freely from that point on, which everyone agreed was exactly right. Jamie started at the county school in 1881 and came home on the first day with the news that there were other children who did not know how to read yet, which he had found genuinely astonishing. Georgia sat him down and explained that different people began knowing different things at different times, and that the important thing was to be kind about it, and he listened to this with his father's attentive stillness and then said, "I know." I helped 2 of them with their letters, and went to do his chores with an air of having managed the situation. Grant heard this at supper and looked at Georgia over the children's heads with an expression that was entirely private and entirely theirs. Little Maddie, at 3, had the run of the ranch in the way that 3-year-olds do when they are confident and surrounded by people who adore them, which was somewhat alarming to Georgia in some aspects but deeply satisfying in others, because she had never not known where her daughter belonged. Georgia's drawings had accumulated over the years into something considerable, many sketch books, stored in the box alongside her mother's things, and a growing number of framed pieces that hung in the ranch house. Some were landscapes, the panhandle in its many moods. Some were portraits: Grant at the corral fence, Ruth with her coffee in the morning, Mrs. Aldridge at the stove, Jamie on his first horse, Maddie sleeping with her fist curled under her chin. 1 or 2 had found their way to people in Callowell who had asked about them, and the minister's wife had one hanging in the church hall that people came to look at specifically when they were in the building, which Georgia learned second-hand and found simultaneously embarrassing and quietly wonderful. It was Ruth who said, one afternoon in the sitting room, "You should do something with these. You should let people see them." "People see them," Georgia said. "More people," Ruth said, with the particular brand of patience she deployed when she knew she was right and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "In the cities, San Antonio or further, there are people who collect art, Georgia." Georgia looked at the sketch book in her lap. "I am a rancher's wife," she said. "You are a rancher's wife," Ruth agreed, "who is also a remarkable artist. There is no rule against being both." Georgia thought about this for a few days, in the way she thought about things that mattered, turning them over, looking at them from different angles, feeling where they resisted and where they gave. She told Gran about it on a Friday evening on the porch, coffee in hand, the children asleep inside and the fall stars out in their usual extravagance. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which she appreciated because she was still working out what she thought. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" She considered. "I think I would like to try," she said. "I do not know what will come of it, but I think I would like to try." "Then we will find out how to do it," he said simply. In 1883, through a connection made by the minister's wife with a woman in San Antonio who knew art buyers and collectors, 3 of Georgia's pieces were shown in a private gathering. The response was not dramatic. Life rarely provided the dramatic response at the pivotal moment. But it was genuine, and 2 of the pieces sold, and the buyer wrote Georgia a letter saying that her landscapes captured something he had never been able to adequately put into words about the panhandle, and that he would very much like to see more of her work. Georgia read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in November, with Jamie eating his breakfast across from her, and Maddie trying to get the cat to sit on her lap. She folded the letter carefully and looked at her children and her kitchen and the morning light coming through the east window, and she thought about a girl who had been told her whole life that she was not worth anything, who had arrived at a strange place with one carpetbag and a box of books, and who had found in that place, and in the man who lived in it, the full truth about herself. Grant came in from the morning barn work, stamping dust off his boots in the doorway, and he looked at her expression and said, "Good news." "Very good news," she said, and held out the letter. He read it standing in the doorway, still holding his hat in one hand, and when he finished he looked at her with the expression that she knew now as his fullest one, not the careful, controlled expressions of a man on the ranch, but the open, unguarded one that was for her alone. "I told you," he said softly. "You told me," she agreed. He came across the kitchen and put the letter on the table and pulled her up from the chair and held her, and she pressed her face against the front of his coat, and felt the steady warmth of him and the solid ground of everything they had made together. And Jamie made a sound of protest that suggested this level of parental affection was excessive at breakfast. And Maddie dropped the cat to come and push herself between them the way she always did, insisting on being included. And Grant laughed and pulled them both in, all three of them, and Georgia stood in the center of it all and felt the full weight of a life that was entirely, irreversibly hers. The years settled into their shape, and the shape was good. Tom Reeves lived in his house on the south edge of the property for another 6 years before he passed peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1888, and they buried him on the Hadley land, as he had said he wanted, under a live oak by the creek. The whole ranch attended, and Georgia drew his portrait from memory that evening, his profile against the sunset, exactly as she had drawn it on her third evening at the ranch all those years ago, the first portrait she had ever drawn of a person she did not already love, and she put it in a good frame, and it hung in the front room beside the map of the property. Ruth Hadley's health declined slowly through the latter part of the decade, as the health of a woman in her 70s will do, and she did it with the same straight-backed composure she brought to everything. She remained in the house, in her room, with her coffee in the morning and her opinions about everything until near the end. Georgia sat with her in the evenings in those last months, and they talked about Maddie Wells sometimes, and about the way things ended and the way things continued, and Ruth held Georgia's hand and said once, quietly, "You were exactly what I hoped you would be." Georgia had squeezed her hand and not tried to speak. Ruth Hadley passed in the autumn of 1889, and the grief of it was real and lasting, as grief for the right people always is. Grant carried it quietly, the way he carried things, and Georgia stayed close to him in the weeks that followed, not hovering but present, the way he had always been for her, and slowly the weight of it shifted from acute to something that could be held. Maddie and Jamie were 10 and 14 by then, and they grieved their grandmother in the ways appropriate to their ages and natures, Jamie quietly and deeply, Maddie with an immediate, full-throated sadness that burned hot and then converted itself, over weeks, into the habit of telling stories about Ruth Hadley to anyone who would listen. Georgia thought that was perhaps the finest thing a person could leave behind. Life on the ranch continued its forward motion. Jamie, at 15, was already thinking about the land the way his father thought about it, with a long view and a careful attention, and he had conversations with Grant about the management of the cattle and the range that Georgia listened to, with the pride of a woman watching something she loves go on correctly. Maddie, with her grandmother's direct tongue and her mother's observational eye, was a force of nature in the Callowell schoolhouse and had opinions about mathematics, which was her best subject, that she offered without apology to anyone who was within earshot. Georgia's art had developed over the years into a body of work that was known, in a quiet way, beyond the panhandle. She had sold perhaps 20 pieces, mostly landscapes, to buyers in San Antonio and one in Austin, and a man from a newspaper in Dallas had written to ask if she would allow her drawings to be reproduced in an illustrated supplement, which she had agreed to after careful consideration. None of it was fame. Fame was not what she had ever wanted, but it was recognition, real recognition, of something she had made with her own hands and eyes and mind. She showed Grant the Dallas letter, and he said, with a quiet and absolute certainty, "Of course." She showed Jamie and Maddie, and Maddie said loudly that her mother was famous, and Jamie said she was not quite famous, and Maddie said she was to her, and Georgia had laughed until she had to sit down. On an October evening in 1890, when the panhandle had put on its particular autumn magnificence, and the light was the gold color that painters traveled great distances to find, Georgia sat on the front porch of the Hadley ranch with her sketchbook open on her knee, and she was drawing the view she had drawn 100 times: the long pasture, the line of trees at the creek, the sky going amber at the horizon, and she was not trying to capture it because it could not be captured. But she was trying to be in conversation with it, which was the true purpose of drawing, and which she had only fully understood in the years since she had been free to do it without apology. Grant came out and set her coffee beside her without interrupting and settled into the chair to her left, and he had the week's accounts, but he was not looking at them yet. He was looking at the sky. 16 years, he said. She looked at him. He had changed in 16 years, a little gray at the temples now, and the weather in his face had deepened, but the eyes were the same, dark and attentive and honest. "Is that what you were counting?" she said. "Since I rode to your father's fence line," he said. He looked at her. 16 years since I did the most self-serving thing I ever did in my life." She raised an eyebrow. "Self-serving." "I told myself I was doing it because you deserved better," he said. "And you did, but I also wanted very much to know the person my mother had described to me. I should confess that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the sketchbook and set it on the rail and said, "Grant Hadley, you rode 40 miles before dawn to come and take a woman away from a father who had decided she was worthless, and you gave her a room and a horse and a garden and your family and your honest opinion of her talents and all the coffee she could drink." He said nothing. He was waiting. She could feel him waiting. "If that is self-serving," she said, "then it is the finest quality of self-serving I have ever encountered, and I intend to be grateful for it every remaining day of my life." The corner of his mouth lifted, that left-side smile, the one she had been cataloging since the first afternoon. "That is very gracious of you," he said. "It is the least I can do," she said. She picked up her coffee. They sat in the October light, side by side on the porch of the house they had built into their lives together, and the land stretched out before them in its ancient and enduring beauty. And inside the house, their children's voices moved through the rooms, and the work of a full life waited for tomorrow. And Georgia Wells Hadley looked at the horizon and thought about the girl who had stood at a fence line with one carpetbag and nothing left of herself that she believed had value. And she thought about the road between that girl and this woman, and she was glad of every mile of it, because every mile of it had led here. To the porch and the light and the coffee and the man beside her who had looked at her, that first day, and seen exactly who she was. She reached over without looking away from the horizon, and her hand found his on the arm of his chair, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat together while the panhandle went from gold to rose to the deep blue of full evening, and the first stars came out overhead, the same stars that had always been there, and everything was as it should be.